Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. On this video I'm going to be looking at national minorities, propaganda and culture under Lenin and Stalin in the years 1917 to 1941. Now we'll start with national minorities, and we'll start with Lenin. Now Lenin promised self-determination to the various national minority groups within the Russian Empire during the revolution in 1917. And this was fulfilled not long afterwards with the Decree on Nationalities in November 1917. Now, this might look like a great gracious offer by Lenin and show a strong belief in kind of self-determination for all the different nationalities, but actually it was really to do with the weakness of the Bolsheviks in any area kind of outside the capital. So it's like a lot of stuff with Lenin in 1917. It's more of a kind of realization of how things are rather than kind of policy making as you might normally think of it. Now, there were several areas that wanted full independence from Russian control. They included Finland, the Ukraine and Georgia. As a Georgian himself, Stalin seen the natural choice to become Commissar for Nationalities in the new government. Not really a role he was actually particularly suited to, and one of the things we'll see is his brutality in dealing with his fellow Georgians. Now, the Civil War further complicated the situation because this gave a huge opportunity to national minorities to gain self-government, to gain greater self-control over their own destiny. Finland and the Baltic states all gained independence during this period, and this lasted up until the Second World War, during which the USSR invaded that region and regained control of the Baltic states, but never Finland. During the Civil War, Georgia was under the control of the Mensheviks and seemed likely to demand independence. Now, Stalin decided this was definitely not going to be the case, and he used very heavy-handed methods to keep control of Georgia. And the methods that he used shocked Lenin, and it was one of the reasons that started turning Lenin against him. However, what this did ensure was that Georgia and alongside other important areas of Ukraine ultimately remained under Russian communist control. Now, if we go into the period after the Civil War, we can see that there was an argument going on within the Communist Party. On one hand, you've got Stalin, who favours very much a centralised approach and wanted to assert Russian control across the new state, and it's kind of reflected in his own behaviour and what he did in Georgia. Well, Lenin disagreed with this, and he favoured a union of autonomous Soviet Socialist republics who had voluntarily chosen to be part of this new union of Soviet Socialist republics, the USSR. So Lenin wanted the national minorities to choose to become part of the USSR, while Stalin wanted to make them. Now, Lenin's view prevailed. Unsurprisingly, he was the leader at the time. However, the reality of the new state was that the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic was completely dominant. Its size, its economy, its political power meant that it remained the dominant force. And the Communist Party in the SSRs in the other nations were subservient to the Russian Communist Party based in Moscow. So, although seemingly Lenin got his way, the decentralization that Stalin really desired was kind of embedded right from the beginning. There was a period of improved tolerance, and we see this extending to one of the key national minorities, the Jewish population, and the Soviet Jews were protected, and a national homeland was created in the far east of Russia, where Jews were free to maintain their cultural heritage. And all anti-Semitic laws that had been in place were abolished, and Yiddish was accepted as a language. So we see some progress here under Lenin. But when we move into the period under Stalin's control, then we can see this is going to be one where there's far less tolerance of national minorities. And again, without turning into kind of psycho-historians looking into the deep-seated inner reaches of Stalin's mind, a lot of people argue that actually it's his Georgian background that made Stalin so harsh when it came to national minorities. It's like he constantly needs to prove himself and show his loyalty to Russia. But we've seen already he also had this greater instinct for greater centralized control. Now, one of the most horrendous sets of policies, and there are many under Stalin, but one of the most horrendous was this policy use of deportations. Now, what he did is he didn't want the national minorities to gain kind of strength and control in their areas. So what he did is he moved millions of people around. And this would stop organised opposition to the regime. So Finns and Poles were deported from the eastern areas of Belarus and the Ukraine. Koreans were deported from the east of the USSR. Kurds were deported from the Caucasus. And as war approached, and many of the Poles who had recently come under Russian control, as well as Germans and Romanians in their areas, were deported from the western edge of the USSR, and they were deported east. So if and when the Germans did invade, then they wouldn't have these national minorities who might well support them. Another kind of a real tragedy of Stalin's policy towards national minorities, it was particularly with what was inflicted on Ukraine. So Ukraine had a kind of a strong separatist movement, and Stalin was determined to crush it. And the methodology used to do this seems to largely, with the famine, seems to be through starvation. Ukrainian nationalism was unlikely to pose a threat under these horrendous circumstances. Now, Stalin could have eased these circumstances, but he maintained the government demands on grain, even though the population was starving. He refused foreign help for Ukraine, even though the population was starving. Now, this in the 30s maybe helped Stalin maintain control there in the Ukraine and crush the opposition that was there. But the resentment of Stalin and Russia remained, and the Ukrainians were said to have done very little to resist the Nazi invasion. In fact, in some places there was celebration of the German troops coming in because of this kind of resentment, this hatred towards Stalin and his regime, and the way the Ukraine had been treated. Now, as the prospect of war increased, Soviet propaganda increasingly focused on a nationalistic Russian message. Stalin was depicted as this potential war leader, following the footsteps of great Russian leaders of the past. An expression of non-Russian identity became less and less tolerated. In the Great Terror, many of the victims were from national minorities, and again, they were more likely to be because they were more likely to be deemed as not being loyal enough. And from 1938, learning Russian became compulsory in all schools in the USSR. So in a way, the suppression of the national minorities was again based on another area of insecurity. It was Russian insecurity about the future and the potential of a war, and this kind of mentality that Stalin absolutely always held, which was you either with him or against him. And so he was trying to enforce a kind of uniformity of nationality across the USSR. There was also a rise in anti-Semitism in the 1930s, and the collectivization drive campaign against kulaks was often accompanied by anti-Semitic rhetoric in areas with Jewish populations. When the USSR invaded and took over eastern Poland, 2 million more Jews came under Soviet control, and many rabbis and Jewish religious leaders were arrested in the aftermath. And we see here mass deportation of Jews from Poland to the east. So national minorities, we see a shift between Lenin and Stalin, and we're going to move on to the other areas now. So I'm going to start with propaganda and then move on to culture. And again, we will see some similarities, but also some differences between Lenin and Stalin. So Lenin was an expert at propaganda. We see this very clearly right from the beginning. So he uses snappy slogans in 1917, such as "All power to the Soviets," "Peace, bread and land." And this contributed greatly to the growth of the Bolshevik Party and its eventual ability to seize power. And once in power, he continued this focus on propaganda. And what he wanted the Russian people to do was to focus on defeating their class enemies, the bourgeois. And this gave Lenin a kind of a very useful scapegoat where he could direct people's anger towards a common enemy in a way from any criticisms of the new regime. So if things went wrong, it was the fault of these class enemies who were undermining the revolution and undermining the benefits that the Russian people would otherwise see. And during the Civil War, Lenin used propaganda again to portray the White Armies as agents of Tsarism and under the control of hostile foreign capitalist powers. So again, he was able to portray the Red Army, which was as brutal, if not more brutal, than the White Armies, as the defenders of the people, and the whites as those who wanted to oppress them or bring in the threat from foreign capitalist powers. Now, Stalin is probably the absolute master when it comes to propaganda, and one of the things that is difficult with totalitarian regimes like Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany is unpicking why people didn't resist more, or why people seemingly went along with what they were being told. Now, from the outside looking in, often what we do is we see the terror and go, right, okay, well, you'd behave yourself in the Stalinist Russia, wouldn't you? Because otherwise you can see what's happening to anybody who shows even the slightest hint of being against Stalin, or even if they haven't, and Stalin's paranoia that makes him believe that they are. So there's a tradition in amongst Western historians to view the main kind of reason for support being the terror, and then also this enormous amount of propaganda that was used, and therefore any support that is seemingly evident is manufactured rather than genuine. And the cult of personality is one of the elements of this. It's seen as a symbol of manufactured support. But revisionist historians have looked at this and started to challenge this viewpoint and started to suggest, well, actually, in a way, the Soviet government was responding to public opinion as well as it was trying to mobilize it and shape it. And actually, there was a groundswell of support for Stalin and his regime, and it wasn't all manufactured through propaganda and terror. So there's an interesting, again, historical debate in there. So the purpose of propaganda under Stalin was to reinforce the beliefs in the socialism and Soviet government, and in that we can see things in common with what was happening under Lenin. However, another was the development of the cult of personality. Now, this wasn't something that Lenin lent into, and this was about securing support for the leadership. So it's not just the socialist ideals and that Stalin is interested in. He's interested in devout support for his individual leadership. Methods that they used included the youth organizations through the Commissar, education, the media, the arts, popular culture, political rituals, and leisure activities. And therefore, in almost all aspects of people's lives, they would be exposed to kind of this positive image of the Soviet government and of Stalin as a leader. One of the big parts of this is the cult of personality. So, and really there are two cults of personality. There's a cult of personality around Lenin and there's a cult of personality around Stalin. Now, the difference between these is the one around Lenin starts when he's buried, whilst the one with Stalin happens whilst he's alive and is leader. So Lenin dies and is hailed as a hero of the revolution. His image appears in many forms, in newspapers and statues and cinema. His likeness is used to motivate the population and to show his commitment to the revolution. And the idea is to be like Lenin, to show the same level of commitment that he did. Lenin was embalmed and displayed in a mausoleum in Red Square in the center of Moscow, and this is a really striking use of the idea of Lenin, this cult of personality and this kind of deification almost of him. Petrograd was renamed Leningrad in 1924 in honor of his achievements for the revolution. And Stalin links himself to this. He promotes himself as the worthy continuer of Lenin. And the cult, therefore, is very politically useful to him. And we see the second cult emerging, and as Stalin himself. Tsarist is renamed Stalingrad as early as 1923. I mean, Stalingrad will then go on to great significance during the Second World War. And Stalin started to promote this slogan, Stalin is the Lenin of today, which started to catch on not long after Lenin's death. But it particularly was used through the 1930s. And in the 30s, we see endless images of Stalin as a great leader. Propaganda also highlighted that he was a man of the people. He would dress simply. There was endless images of him with workers or peasants, with children, and he was presented as a down-to-earth man, happy in plain clothes, smoking his pipe, a man of kind of simple pleasure. So the kind of relatable character for the Russian people. And this cult of personality made use of traditional Russian attitudes in which an individual would embody the state. And this had been the case with the Tsars. And there'd been this cult around the Tsars, and they'd been placed there by God. But obviously, the communists don't believe in God, but that similar idea is put there that Stalin is separate, he is above, and as is Lenin, and there's this continuation going back through Stalin to Lenin and then off back into Marx, and these are the kind of the symbols and the figures that the Russian people should look up to. We see control of all of this through the media, and in particular newspapers and radio ensured that the Soviet people were only ever exposed to a very narrow range of views. So Pravda and Zvestia were the two leading newspapers, and they were used for propaganda. And access to the printing press was restricted. So essentially, you got the government line, or you got nothing. And those who were given access to printing presses had to be in line with the interests and the workers of the socialist order, which of course was defined by the government, and what that meant was what the government wanted it to mean. And again, even right now, we can see a continuation of this with a Russian government taking very tight control over the media and what lines and what information the population is allowed to access. Radio stations were also controlled by the government, conveyed official messages alongside light or classical music. There was a limited amount of information that was given to the population, and the idea of this was to restrict the level of public debate. So some things would be allowed for public debate, but most things wouldn't. And one of the motivations for this enormous leap forward that we've seen in literacy was for propaganda. So if you had a literate population, you could indoctrinate them, you could fill their heads with propaganda, and make sure that they followed your lines and your view of the world, and that's very much what the Soviet government aimed to do. We saw many kind of aspects of this. I mean, big deal was made out of public celebrations to mobilize the population. Celebration of the anniversary of the October Revolution was a kind of really big and heavily stage managed event by the government. And the government would look for positives. They would look for things to celebrate and could bring a source of pride in the Soviet state. So even if people's day-to-day life was fairly hard and miserable, then there could be this bit of, well, you are a small cog of this massive wheel, and look at the wonderful things we are achieving. Look at the achievements of the 5-year plans, and the big events to celebrate there. Then again, some big news stories were made out of successful expeditions to the Arctic. And searches for golden oil, were discovered, and a lot of this kind of struck a chord with the Soviet people. Where this is the idea that Soviet technology was triumphing over nature. The aviators who flew over the North Pole were greeted by Stalin as conquering heroes, and they represented the bravery and adventure and the pushing back of frontiers, which is all part of this new kind of Soviet ideal. And this idea that the state was achieving great things and the people should support it. So overall, we see through both Stalin and Lenin that they managed to set up governments that had high level control as the sole provider of information. So the horrors that we see, particularly the horrors in the 1930s of famine and terror, they didn't play a massive role in popular culture because they weren't talked about. In 1935, Stalin exclaimed, "Life has become more joyous." Now, obviously, that is something that could be much debated and almost ridiculed for the majority of people. But films and songs of the time developed this theme. It was a useful form of escapism. And so we've got this kind of gap between reality and what is being presented. Though not all members of the population, or all sectors of the population, are willing to go along with the government lines. There was particularly sections of the rural population remained very hostile. We mentioned again that particularly in areas like the Ukraine. Despite government controls, subcultures and countercultures continued. There was a wide variety of public culture, and therefore it was a very difficult aspect. Culture, getting full control of culture is a very difficult thing. But with Soviet Russia, we see it as one of the examples where this has been done to a quite extreme extent. The view was common in the West during the period of the Cold War that the Soviet population was cowed in terror and forced into behaving itself and following the line. Now, that is probably too simplistic. Terror and force were important methods, but the government was able to gain public support through a variety of methods, and propaganda was one of these, in particular where propaganda built on trends and themes that already existed in Soviet society. And we see this in particular with things like the cult of personality. So now I'm going to move on to culture. And although government was aware of the value of using arts and popular culture for their own purposes, by 28 they hadn't done a huge amount to enforce a kind of rigid area of control. And so we do see greater cultural freedom under Lenin than we will do under Stalin. And that was particularly true in the period of the NEP, where there was greater tolerance of non-proletarian authors and artists, as long as their lines were roughly in line with the general value of communist values. And these were often described by Lenin as the fellow travelers. Now, this kind of freedom ends really with the Cultural Revolution in the years 1928 to 32, where arts and popular culture became a kind of key battleground for the parties. It tried to root out all elements of bourgeois culture and construct a kind of new Soviet culture, which reinforced socialist values and the policies and support for the government. Now, this is one of the areas where there was seen to be excesses and things were seen to have gone too far, and so the government tried to kind of rein some of the more radical groups in on this and try and take a stronger control from 32 onwards. And we see this period known as socialist realism, and this form of art and culture was to portray socialist values through a kind of a utopian vision of a perfect socialist future, and as well as support for the policies of the leadership, including the cult of personality around Stalin. And so Stalin would often be portrayed in these kind of socialist realist images. Now, during that Cultural Revolution, and this is where we get the excesses, we get the Commissol enthusiasts who were encouraged to root out and attack bourgeois elements, and then theatre productions where the plays were maybe not completely in line with the beliefs of communism would be disrupted by booing and whistling by overexcited members of the Commissol. In literature, we see the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers increasingly attacking non-communist writers and condemning kind of the individualism of writers who adopted new experimental techniques. And this is quite an ongoing theme actually with culture in communist Russia, where anything new that isn't government approved is then seen as Western and decadent, and the sort of experimentation and trying things becomes an unwise move. And so what we see is works that stress the achievements of the workers in what is termed the cult of the little man. Katyev's novel Time Forward in 32 is a good example of this, and this showed particular kind of workers' success and on a particular project, and we get a whole series of novels along this line. The kind of a nice kind of pithy summary of it is this idea boy meets girl meets tractor, where it's the kind of stories you would normally see, but kind of twisted in a way to highlight the communist ideals and the achievement of workers. And again, it's in a way that we would maybe see in the West, the embodying of the American dream in Hollywood. In the USSR, what we're seeing is this cult of the little man, the worker working hard for the greater good of Soviet society. And we've got not only this aim to destroy bourgeois culture, but we want this vision of what a new socialist culture would be like. We saw in this period a brief flowering of kind of visionary utopianism, with this idea of a completely reshaping society in the future, communal living, complete breakdown of old ideas like family. But a lot of these ideas were seen as being too radical for a lot of party members, and I'd include Stalin amongst this. And by the end of the first 5-year plan, the government was ready to take more control over cultural organisation. And the Cultural Revolution had done part of its job, that it had removed a load of the older intelligentsia, but it replaced it with this new group of Soviet intellectuals who would, to varying degrees, either sit in line with the government or sometimes clash with it. So from 32 onwards, we get socialist realism, and we see this in literature with the Union of Soviet Writers replacing the rap, and this in effect brought the Cultural Revolution to an end. Stalin recognised the importance of writers, calling them the engineers of the human souls, and we start to see a standard plot in literature in the 30s with a hero from the people is guided by the party to greater things, and we see this in high literature in the works of Sokolov and Gorky, and lowbrow literature, which was more tend to focus either on war stories or Russian heroes from the past, or detective novels where the police would thwart the plots of evil capitalists. And again, just like you would see in Western bit, where you get through different contextually, the bad guys were always from particular parts of the world and things like that. In Russian literature, the bad guys are always the evil capitalists. And we see again this combination with the rising literacy rate. So we've got low priced books, we've got a huge increase in literacy, and so we see an enormous number of people kind of reading these things, and this is the only thing that they can read, and so it builds in these ideals and these ideas in people. So we see with socialist realism in art, we see the rejection of abstract art as posters and paintings and sculptures and all other forms of art were kind of presented as kind of clear images of peasants and workers, strongly realistic, often working for socialism, gaining strength through their efforts. And we see vast statues of Stalin and numerous ones of Lenin appearing across the country. And in this, it would always be portrayed in the best, most positive light. But the idea is it would look like people and be people, and it would look like a field. It wouldn't be abstract. It wouldn't be it show those kind of what they would describe as bourgeois decadent elements from the West. We also see in architecture, and the Cultural Revolution gave way to what's often known as Stalinist Baroque, and this is also referred to as wedding cake architecture, which is again quite entertaining. Many of the public buildings were built on this in this style. We can see an example of that above me, which is the Moscow University, and then we see the Moscow Metropolitan, the Moscow metro system, which often was another kind of fine example of Stalinist Baroque architecture with the layers and inside. I mean, the stations are something to behold, with really ornate murals displaying the kind of the workers, and would be the big chandeliers and things like that. So, kind of really impressive structures. Music also suffered the pressure to toe the line in socialist realism. Stalin himself walked out of a musical performance of Stefanovich's opera Lady Macbeth, no, this is a politically correct story of adultery, but he walked out. I know this wasn't the official line given at the time, but this is what we understand. That he walked out at his shock at the bedroom scene where the trombones were used to underline what was happening. It was giving us the impression that Stalin himself was rather prudish. And we see this in other elements of music. I mean, there was a brief period where jazz was tolerated in the period that followed the Cultural Revolution, but there was renewed restrictions on it from 1936 onwards. Communist propaganda began to associate jazz with drugs and promiscuity and homosexuality and Western decadence. And therefore, there was a more conservative social and cultural atmosphere in the late 1930s, which jazz just didn't fit into. Another key element that we see in the culture at this period of time is nationalism. Now, this is particularly the case in the late 1930s. As fear of war grew, the party leadership recognised the need to bind the Soviet people together in the event of an attack. So the popular culture was pushed down the line of emphasising nationalism and patriotism. Einstein's film Alexander Nevsky in 1938 conceived to reflect this trend. And the German invasion of 1941 had an enormous impact on all aspects of Soviet life and required the Soviet citizens to be absolutely devoting their energies to the defence of the country. And this could only really be done if the government was able to appeal to a deep sense of Russian patriotism. And Russia, to do this, Stalin declares in 1941, "Let the images of our great ancestors inspire you during this war." So we see even greater emphasis than before the war on military leaders and military heroes from the past, like Kutuzov, the hero in the war against Napoleon. So what we see with this is culture's not set; it shifts depending on the circumstances. And so it would be misleading to think of culture in the period 1924 to 1941 as remaining constant. It doesn't. So we have the distinct period, notably the Cultural Revolution, followed by socialist realism. Despite the directives issued by the government, there was some variety in the content of what was produced, and there were very brave people, some of whom ended up in exile or in the gulags or even dead, who were prepared to push the boundaries of what was acceptable. Nonetheless, the overall picture was of party leadership using arts and popular cultures as an instrument to control society and maintain their own political power. So I hope that's been useful for you and giving you an overview of the plight of national minorities and then also propaganda and culture under Lenin and Stalin. And this, as I've said at the beginning, is part of my series on Tsarist and Communist Russia, which I will be continuing, and I'll be pushing on to go through the war period and then the period that follows with the high Stalinism and Khrushchev. Thank you very much for watching.